Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the launch event for the Higher Education Credit Framework for England. My name is Dr. Andy Smith. I'm the Quality and Standards Manager here at the QAA. I'm delighted to say that we are also joined today by Douglas Blackstock, who is the Chief Executive of the QAA, and Professor Sue Rigby, Vice Chancellor of Bath Spa University, and also Chair of the Advisory Group. I'm also joined today by my colleagues, Amy Spencer. So Amy is the Zoom host for today. If you have any technical issues or problems, please address them to Amy. My colleague Sai will also be joining us, Sai Bullock, and he will be chairing the panel discussion that we will have later on as part of the launch event. As usual with these events, there is some Zoom etiquette. Amy's posted in the chat. Please keep your mics and cameras turned off if you can. And if you have any questions as we go along, please post them in the chat function and we will see if we can answer them in the panel discussion. So just to talk a little bit about the agenda for today. So as you can see, it's a fairly tight schedule. We have a welcome address by Douglas, who I'll hand over to fairly soon, followed by also some comments from Sue on the work of the group and the advice in general. We'll then have a panel discussion chaired by Sai Bullock with Lucy Dawkins, Claire Milsom, Steve Taylor and Daryl Bravenboyle, who are all part of the advisory group. And we're also joined today by Johnny Barnes, a postgraduate student who's also on the QAA Student Strategic Advisory Committee. Following the panel discussion, I will take you through the two documents that compose the Credit Framework for England, and we're hopeful of finishing round about 3:15, so just over an hour and 15 minutes for this event. So I'm going to hand over to Douglas now, who will give you some comments and perspectives on credit, just particularly as it relates to policy shifts and changes to the higher education sector. So Douglas, over to you.
Thanks, Andy. And I think I've finally, after 18 months, I hope, mastered how to turn the mute button off. So hopefully you can hear me. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I was going to say that we're all used to this experience of seeing everyone on the screen, but it's not quite that, because not everyone all of the time, because there are limits on the screens. But I think over the last year or so, we've become used to seeing pets and accidental pajamas and all sorts of other things in meetings. Some colleagues are suggesting they'll miss that. I'm in the camp of looking forward to go back to being in the office, although maybe less on the trains and the planes, etc. The last year has truly impacted on higher education in a fundamental way right across the world. And it's important now, though, that we start to look ahead and ask what higher education will look like after the COVID pandemic. And as economies and societies start to rebuild past the pandemic, our sector will be right at the forefront of addressing skills needs. People will need to retrain and students will need to change industries post-graduation. Across populations, people will need strong digital literacy, flexible skills, and an ability to innovate. The impact of the pandemic has reinvigorated discussions about shorter credit-bearing courses and micro-credentials in the UK and internationally. The debate about creating new routes for accessing and benefiting from higher education has intensified. In the UK, the Westminster government have been clear that they are interested in lifelong flexible learning. We saw the new skills and post-16 education bill in England last week. It will introduce the lifetime skills guarantee the Prime Minister announced in September. This will allow for flexible learning and funding to sit alongside more traditional and still very much in demand models of higher education. Across Europe too, ministers have acknowledged in the Rome communique last year as part of the European Higher Education Area Ministerial Conference that there is a need for a swift updating of knowledge, skills and competencies in the decade to come. Micro-credentials are an important part of this, and in December, the European Commission published its final report on a European approach to micro-credentials. There's a proposed EU standard which will record key information, including aims and learning outcomes. And across the world, there are new systems for flexible credit, from the New Zealand Qualifications Authority reforms to, again in Europe, the INCA Microball project. Alongside the Westminster reforms, Wales is looking to a new tertiary education model with a new commission expected in 2023. Now we have confirmation of the government. And in Scotland, the ongoing review from the Scottish Funding Council is calling for more local, coherent post-16 provision. So there are a range of approaches, but a trend across the UK towards a more joined up, flexible tertiary education system in common with many other countries moving in a similar direction. That's why QA has had a lot of focus in our work, looking in particular on flexible learning and credit over the last year. It's been really important to us that as we develop in this area, this is sector-led, sector initiatives, rather than policy handed down to the sector from others. We're funding some really interesting and innovative collaborative enhancement partnership projects, and many of you will be involved in them. There's including one on modular learning by Bath College, and involving partners including Bath Spa University, the Universities of Middlesex, Staffordshire and Coventry. And with the current QA Scotland enhancement theme, we have a new collaborative cluster project on digital badging. We recently published a Quality Compass report exploring micro-credentials. And last autumn, on behalf of our members, we engaged with the Prime Minister's advisors and the Department for Education on the evolving policy relating to qualifications and credit, including bringing together policymakers with HE and FE providers to look at the new opportunities and the regulatory barriers to reform. The Skills White Paper, published in January, acknowledged that the regulatory system needs to evolve to support radically different flexible arrangements. We know that increased capacity, increased adaptability in the accumulation of credit will be encouraged. New technical qualifications will be developed, meaning that achievements at levels 4 and 5 will be considered on their own merits, rather than always necessarily leading as a stepping stone to a level 6 qualification. The challenge for our sector is to embrace change in order to reflect the increasingly complex needs of students and society, which is why last year we began the reviewing the higher education credit framework in England. It was last updated in 2008, and we took the view that it needed to take account of more than a decade of change, but being in a position to help shape the future. And in that respect, we are really grateful to Professor Sue Rigby, who's also a member of the QA board, who I'll hand over to in a minute. Sue has led this work over the last year, as Andy said. What we wanted to do was support the sector to develop credit-bearing qualifications which are agile, local and short, especially in the post-pandemic recovery. They won't replace traditional full degrees, but they can complement them. They can offer choice, and choice and agency for students is important in terms of what they learn and how they learn it. We want to give qualifications lasting value and explore how they can be lifelong and transferable. Each part can build to a larger whole tailored for individual learners. The challenge with this is how to make these awards coherent. The possibilities depend on the sector's cooperation. There needs to be close collaboration and agreement between providers and strategic long-term investment to make it work. The credit accumulation and transfer are not new issues. Indeed, I remember the intense discussions in 1986-87 when I was a student union president around the development of CAT systems. But we hope that the new framework today will lay the foundation to support innovation to come. So thanks to everyone who's contributed to the development of this revised framework. Really grateful for all the time, effort and energy you've put in whatever way you've been able to do that. You've shaped it as, once again, QA working with and for the sector to develop sector-led guidance and frameworks. So thank you again, and with that I'll hand over to Sue.
And just in the interest of transparency, I'd ask you all just to come briefly to Edinburgh, south side of Edinburgh, where my next door neighbour clearly ordered a sofa, which was delivered this morning, only to find that it was too large to go up the stairs. But as he's quite a wholehearted man, he simply removed the windows of his first floor flat and attempted to get the sofa in through the windows, only to find that the sofa is too big to go in through the windows. So he's currently sawing the legs off his sofa in order to pull it in through the window. And then the glaziers have arrived to replace the glass after he's done this. So just in case you hear the odd noise off, I just wanted to give you a kind of visual, verbal picture of what's going on in my life just at the moment. But oddly, actually, that's not a bad kind of analogy or maybe kind of reference point for the kind of working conditions that my brilliant panel faced as they rewrote the credit framework. Because we had one face-to-face meeting, and we knew that things were getting a bit tricky and there were restrictions on being too close to too many people at once coming in, but it didn't stop us meeting in a room, you'll remember this, physically, face-to-face, talking to one another, having lunch together. And we thought that was the most marvellous way of working. We were writing things on whiteboards and getting on famously, and we've never met since. And I think it's really important to remember as we launch the new credit framework today, and I'm incredibly proud of it. I'm proud of the people who worked on it, just what the conditions were under which we were operating. The vast majority of us are senior members of staff in universities or in the QAA, and we were moving our institutions into an emergency online mode. We were moving our teams into distance working, and then we were going through the 3 lockdowns, the 3 unlockings, what we reckon is 47 changes of government direction around teaching since March last year. And during all of that, the team that put together the credit framework that you see today carried on with it. I think sometimes the meetings were almost like therapy, because we could get deeply involved in some aspect of credit transfer and forget just briefly that it felt like the world was in a post-apocalyptic state of meltdown. We loved Maureen's cat picture, particularly after that lawyer, do you remember, in the States, turned up at a hearing and turned into a cat online. But joking apart, I think what the team has achieved has been outstanding in any conditions. But I think we should almost imagine this report always branded and watermarked with the pandemic. In a way, I think it made the work better. We were crisper, we thought about less, we saved our ammunition for really important discussions that we felt really mattered. But when we did come to want something that mattered, we absolutely worried at it until it gave up on us, and we never gave up on it. And then by the time we'd written text in some form or other, what we left Andy with was the most appalling guddle. All the text sounded like different people. It was written in different tenses. It was written in different persons. The syntax was particular to the particular authors. And what Andy and Si did with enormous patience was pull it together into something that I hope you'll agree sounds both professional and consistent, where all the different voices still have weight in terms of the content, but no longer have an intrusive quality that would have come if we'd led them or left them in that kind of individual state that they were in on submission. I think during the course of the work, we realised that we were, in a way, editing and tinkering something that was very good to begin with. And we thought that possibly it wasn't too mean to suggest that it was so good almost by accident, that it was a post hoc description of a system that was moving to the common use of credit and establishing that in a formalised way. And I think if there was one observation that we made that changed our perceptions of the use of credit, it was that sense that that post hoc description of what was going on in 2008 had accidentally turned into a design blueprint for the recognition and development of new qualifications in 2020 and beyond. And if there's one thing about the government's intentions around torn apart learning, which I think is really exciting and really positive, but if there's one thing we all have to bear in mind as we enter that space, it's the importance of coherent design, making sure that all the pieces build to something emergent that's larger than the sum of the parts. That's entirely within our ambit and our capacities as academics in colleges and universities across the UK. But I think that the design of the credit framework helps us to do that well, and helps us to do it in such a way that transfer of credit and transfer between different institutions at different stages of qualification will be easier, and where our students will get a better deal. The last thing that I want to touch on is one of the real strengths of the panel, which I've not come across before in a lot of the work that I've done in the sector, and that was the pervasive input of students into the process. We were very lucky in the student input into the panel, but we also knew that students more widely were being referenced and brought into the discussion and to the qualifications that we were starting to think about. We're not ever assuming that a student will start their first year at university with the immortal quote, something like, gosh, I must read the credit framework to make sure I understand the design of my qualification. But I do think it's really important that we enable students to explore how their qualifications have been put together, so that they have a voice, both in the quality assurance in their institution and in the co-design of those qualifications themselves. And I think it's a real innovation that the Quality Assurance Agency has been leading, to have students so much front and centre of those design and audit processes. So what can I say? It was a brilliant team. They were incredibly patient. They delivered on time, nearly. We are all still friends, in fact, probably better friends than we were to begin with. We hope that the work that we've produced is of use to the sector. That's why we did it. And we think that in doing it, we maybe discovered one or two things that will be of use going forward into this very unsettled and dynamic future for higher education. So thank you very much for coming today. I will say no more, because many of the people who wrote the credit framework are actually here to be on the panel, and I shall sit back and A, watch a sofa fail to go into the flat next door, and B, really enjoy the wisdom and erudition of my panel members in the next session. So thank you, folks, and over to you.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Douglas, for your comments. It is interesting to reflect on the genesis of this document, and the fact that it was written amongst a global pandemic and working remotely, and a different way of working for QAA again compared to how we've usually worked on developing advisory documents, and possibly a new model of working which will retain some elements of that moving into the future for lots of different reasons. So thank you for that. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Sai, who is going to be chairing the panel discussion, and he will introduce or ask the panelists to introduce themselves as well, and then we'll get into the meat of the discussion with the panel and hear, as Sue said, from some of those who were instrumental in writing and developing the content for both parts of the credit framework documents. So over to you, Sai.
Good afternoon, everyone. Through the developments of the credit framework, we, as our colleagues have outlined, came across a number of different issues, and we thought it might be quite useful to speak to some of the people who are instrumental in putting the framework together, and also bring in a student, because obviously the entire point of the framework is to benefit the student experience. So if I could come to Johnny Barnes from our Student Strategic Advisory Committee first, and just ask, from a student's perspective, how do you think the new credit framework helps to meet the needs of learners?
Yes, hi, thanks everyone, thank you, Sai. So I think it's quite important to be cognizant that students don't have an inbuilt or inherent knowledge of credit. You don't begin your university life knowing about how your degree is structured. And students generally learn about credit over time, and they start to associate it with, oh, I have a 60 credit module, which has twice the amount of teaching that my 30 credit one does, and as a chunkier assessment. And that's sort of how students understand credit mostly. They don't really see it as a tool for transfer until that sort of their need to transfer potentially institutions comes up. But most students do understand that their credit modules are the sort of building blocks of their degrees. So I think that's just a nice background as to how students view credit. So how does the revised credit framework meet the needs of students is sort of a different question. So within the advice on academic credits, arrangements document, part 1, as we used to be called, there's a really great visual for the progression throughout the typical qualification stages. And this is a really useful visual for students that maybe have sub-degree qualifications, so they can see where they're going next, or students that have had to take an early exit qualification as part of their degree for one reason or another and are looking to come back in. Then they can see, oh, okay, I've got my diploma of higher education. Okay, I can see that I might be able to use that to top up. And I think that links really well with recognition of prior learning. So the revised credit framework works really well to invite students to have a conversation with new institutions if they are thinking of transferring or coming back from a study break. It invites them to have that conversation with the institution, because RPL can be quite a long process, but it invites that conversation about and makes it quite clear if students are in that position. They can refer to the credit framework and go, okay, this is my current position, this is what might be able to happen. And I think that's a really good thing. And I also think the revised credit framework, particularly this part 2, the making use of credit document, starts to ask and answer questions around lifelong learning and credit stackability, to spark those questions within institutions and within the sector to get the foundations and architecture of these micro-credential style of qualifications ready, so that when they become a slightly larger part, they're ready for students to sort of go straight in with. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. I'd like to come to Lucy next, and just to introduce her, it's Dr. Lucy Dawkins from the Royal College of Art. And I'd like to come to you with a similar question, if that's okay, Lucy. Mm-hmm. Just to ask how students at all levels benefit from understanding credit, and just give an idea how credit works, particularly maybe in terms of the structure of awards and the flexibility that it offers.
Yeah, so it's a kind of an expansion on what Johnny was talking about. And as they both said, Sue and Johnny said, credits are the building blocks of most awards. As curriculum designers, it's usually the place that you start from. How many credits do you have? How do you dispense those credits? And what do those credits mean for students? HE professionals generally have a very strong understanding of how to use credit to enable students to learn, but students don't always understand how those things fit together. The greatest benefit for students in understanding how credit works is, as Johnny was saying, the flexibility. I work at the Royal College of Art. Our cohorts are exclusively postgraduate. And a lot of our students, if not all of our students, have competing demands on their time. They have professional or personal commitments that they need to think about alongside their studies. If they understood or had a better understanding of how credit works, they'd be able to take a greater sense of autonomy over their learning, because they would know the points that they could step in and step out of their studies, where the pause points were, if you will, within their awards. Thinking particularly too about stackability, this idea that smaller credit blocks in other awards can build towards a kind of a larger umbrella award, is an idea that I'm sure we'll come to in the conversation about microcredits, but it's now starting to develop into more standardized or recognized awards too, that students can build their awards in ways that we haven't really seen before, which is really exciting, but it only works if students understand the credits that they are working towards and that they are gathering. The other thing that an understanding of credit would give to students is a better understanding of assessments, and particularly around proportionality. And it's kind of what Johnny was saying about students know that a 60 credit unit is going to have a lot more work involved in it than a 30 credit unit, but they don't always understand why. I think if students are empowered to understand credit and the credit framework, they are able to marshal their resources more effectively and will have better outcomes because of it. The other thing that credit does, and understanding credit from a student perspective will enable, is a sense of accountability and transparency, both from a student and from an institutional perspective. If a student understands credit and they understand the learning that they're engaging with, they understand the journey they're taking through their credits within a particular qualification, they become more accountable to themselves for their learning. It encourages self-reflection and self kind of understanding, because you know where you're putting your efforts, you know what those efforts are for, and you know what you're getting out of it. It's a much more transparent process. It also enables students to have those conversations with institutions about what these credits mean, how they're using them, what they're for, what they're going towards. And to foster those conversations can only be a good thing, because it means that they become co-designers and co-owners of their learning, rather than just recipients of something that they're not particularly clear on. I think that's, for me, the greatest kind of benefit of being involved in this project, is having that transparency and that accountability embedded within the thinking of the new credit framework. And it was something that I was really pleased to see came through really strongly from all of the panel, was that whenever questions about credit, or, you know, the kind of technicalities that as HE professionals we all understand, were discussed, the fundamental question always came back to, okay, so how do students use this? How is this beneficial? How does this move forward? And I think the document that we've ended up with really answers those questions. So yeah, I think that would be my 2 cents worth.
Thank you, Lucy. I'd like to ask a question to Stephen Taylor next, who's the Dean of HE at Warwickshire College and was our voice of HE and FE on the group. Give me a second. So, Steve, I just wanted to ask how credit supports the learner's journey as they transition into HE from earlier levels, such as foundation programs within the further education sphere.
Yeah, hello everybody. Thanks again for inviting me to be on this panel bit as well at the end of the credit framework launch. So I think going back to the first thing that that Johnny said as well, actually reminds me of kind of my first day, teaching students. It tends to be right, welcome to the course. Right, you're going to be doing this module. This module is called a 20 credit module. And that means it's got 200 learning hours. 200 learning hours means you've got to spend 200 hours on this. We're going to deliver some of it. You're going to do the rest. And I think actually that's a key aspect of any credit-based system. And when you start looking at that way, and you say, well, you're going to be here for 30 weeks, and you've got to get 1,200 learning hours in. Right, that's a 40-hour week then. The math starts to stack up, and some students maybe go screaming from the room at that point, think, oh my goodness me, it's a full-time job. But then that's what it is. They're a full-time student. So I think that infrastructure is really important. In terms of the question about how the credit framework kind of relates to that kind of college HE environment, I think I'd start answering this by saying that in college HE in particular, there's maybe not the same emphasis on the 3-year degree as there is maybe in a university. I think a lot of the students who take degrees in universities are there to study for 3 years. It's what they've been working towards. In college HE, students come from all sorts of different backgrounds, and we therefore have a number of different models. So where I work at Warwickshire College Group, we've had our own foundation degree awarding powers for a number of years now. We write foundation degrees, which are level 4 and 5. And it's great to see the foundation degree, the HND, the HNC, and these kind of things all explicitly referenced within the credit framework. It also really describes the vocational and the traditional academic, if we're going to call it that, although these things cross over, to see that a foundation degree at level 5 is the same as the second year of a degree. We deliver vocational courses, of course, within a college HE environment. A lot of our students will start a level 4-5 course and they will end up moving to the top up. And they may not have been planning to do that when they started. So the ability to use credit in this way means there's staging posts on a student's career. Somebody might decide, I'm going to come in and I'm going to just take the 2-year option. As they go through the 2-year option, they realize that they can progress onto the level 6. And the interesting feedback that we've had for students who do move on to top-ups with us is that their final capstone project or dissertation has a real kind of applied feel to it quite often, because they've come from a level 5 qualification, which was very applied. It was mentioned earlier on, I think Douglas mentioned right at the beginning, the advent of the technical award, the higher technical. At the moment, it's just the digital and cyber, which is being looked at, but there's lots of these planned to roll out. And they're all based on the credit model. I think originally the idea with some of these awards was that they would be a new type of award at level 5. and actually what we've ended up with, if you like, at the moment, is the model of the foundation degree or the HND, the level 4, level 5 award being kite marked potentially by the Institute for Apprenticeships. So you can see how that kind of credit framework is informing the future development of the more technical and vocational environment. And then finally, the point I'd make really about foundation years, because I know that was kind of part of your question in there, Si, really, that there's the ability to be creative with the credit framework. I worked at the University of Northampton before I worked at Warwickshire College, and in both places we created a 4-year foundation, integrated foundation degree, where the first 2 years includes level 4 qualifications. And this is possible to do. It allows students to be scaffolded through their first 2 years before moving on to then the level 5 and the level 6. At Warwickshire College, we've been very much attached it to a widening participation agenda, making that a cheaper fee for those first 2 years. So there's possibility to be creative within the credit framework and to think about not just the usual traditional 3-year degree, but thinking about how it can be kind of flexed and used in different ways. And I'm sure we'll come on to a lot more on the micro-credentials around this kind of area. That's probably about it, really. There's loads I could probably talk about in terms of flexibility, but I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Steve. So next I'd like to come to Professor Darrell Bravenboer, who is the not only the Director of Apprenticeships at Middlesex University, but is also the Chair of SEEK, who's one of the credit framework owners that help feed into and develop this framework itself. I'd just like to ask Darrell, given that all the providers have their own RPL processes, that they can be not just complex, but also not the easiest things in the world to find. Do you think this framework will help cut through some of that and provide some clarity?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Yes, the kind of purposes of credit and what you can do with it are kind of a kind of driving force behind a lot of the work of SEEK that you've mentioned, and the way in which credit can provide opportunities for learners and can provide opportunities for people to progress their careers, progressing through various modes of higher education, is kind of potentially really empowered by credit. But there are barriers, and you know, one of the barriers is that even though, you know, the vast majority of providers of higher education will have regulations and policies and procedures that govern how credit can be used to construct qualifications and programs, and how much credit can be recognised as prior learning to enable people to complete programs of study more quickly and indeed more cost effectively. The fact that each organisation, awarding organisation, tends to have its own regulations and procedures can create an awful lot of complexity in terms of enabling learners to access those procedures and even to know that they exist or how to use them. So there are and that's not a new thing. That's a kind of a long-standing potential barrier. And it's interesting. I was reflecting back on you know, the fact that we've now launching this new HE credit framework. And around about the time of the original one in 2008, there's a lot of focus on flexibility and what different ways that people could access learning, recognising learning in different ways, recognising prior learning, but also using credit to build different kinds of flexible qualifications. And actually, that kind of went away for quite a considerable part of the last decade. And there seems to be an emphasis on how credit was an enabler for people to make kind of market-based decisions upon whether or not they would transfer to a provider that they thought was of better value or not. And that was the real purpose of credit. And I'm really pleased to see that the policy agenda now seems to have shifted more towards, you know, being able to use things like credit, so that it's far more about enabling people to progress their personal careers, you know, part of the whole levelling up agenda and so forth. And, you know, things like the lifetime loan guarantee, part of the Skills for Job paper that Douglas mentioned, you know, are kind of, I think, an important signifier of that kind of shift. So, I mean, what I hope is that, you know, the panel very much, and the group who contributed to the development of the framework, you know, very much wanted to see it as an enabling framework, and that it would steer all those who used it towards some of the possibilities. And by doing that, as Lucy was mentioning, it's kind of empowering, really, because if you don't know that credit can be used to recognise, you know, several years of your learning that you've engaged with, you know, and that it is at higher education level, but you know you wouldn't know so unless you go through a formal process. If you don't know that that's a possibility, then you're not going to be empowered to have a conversation with an admissions tutor for a program to say, well, actually, I've worked for so many years in a very related industry. Is there any way I can gain some recognition for that? You won't know that that can happen unless you can see that there are examples where, and lots of instances where people have actually done that, and that there are facilities to do it. So kind of empowering people with, you know, an understanding of what the possible is a really important function of the framework, it seems to me. And so even if the policies and procedures in individual institutions are buried away in the deepest, darkest kind of corners of websites, the fact that they know that actually most institutions will have those policies, perhaps someone can point me towards them, they can be empowered to at least ask that question, you know. So I think that's a really important kind of contribution that the framework can make. I think also things have moved on, you know, since the last framework. There have been lots of quite innovative and quite impactful changes in higher education. I mean, one of my role at Middlesex as Director of Apprenticeships sort of leads me to think about that a lot. And you know, one of the things about degree apprenticeships is that every single apprentice, before they start an apprenticeship program, a degree apprenticeship or higher apprenticeship or other one, is that they are entitled to have their prior learning assessed before they start. Now that's that kind of, for me, that kind of opens a discussion and a narrative and potentially an entitlement for learners to think about that and how that might operate in a broader higher education landscape. So those kind of changes and those possibilities, you know, really quite potentially significantly affect the kind of the nature of the discussion around how credit can be used in higher education. And I think by providing concrete examples of that, you know, in the making use of credit document, I think it really helps people to understand what, as I said earlier, what the possibilities are, so that they can have those discussions and, you know, raise the queries that they have and make the claims that they want to make on an informed basis. And that's what I really hope the credit framework contributes.
Thank you, Darryl. I'd like to come to Claire next, Professor Claire Milsom, who's the Academic Registrar at Liverpool John Moores University. I'd just like to ask whether you could talk a little bit about how academics will be able to use credit and the credit framework in the design of courses.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. As we've heard from all the panel members, credit really is the building blocks of course design. And for academics engaged in course design, credit provides a framework in which to structure that academic content, the discipline-specific material in a coherent way, as Sue sort of explained in her opening, this sort of coherent, consistent approach. The way we talk about credit, it offers a kind of vocabulary, a common language. It gives us a consistency in the consideration of how to position and organise subject material within, say, a particular period of time or as part of a particular programme. But it gives us that structure to organise the important academic content. And it quantifies that relationship between the learning time and the recognition of potential achievement. And you know, we heard about the 10 notional learning hours per credit, but that does provide a way for academics to consider how to package up the content and how to, I mean, this year in particular, how we've thought about class contact time and then moving to sort of synchronous delivery and asynchronous delivery and supporting material, but it provides that framework to have those conversations around private study, directed learning, and then to think towards the assessment. As we said, this is, as we said at the start about, I've got double the volume of assessment, it's double the size of the module, but for academics to really think about how that actually works and the proportionality, that consideration in the terms of assessment. And that's not taking away the sort of inside point that course design is about the discipline. It's that framework, that consistent, coherent framework, and that vocabulary for academics to use when discussing how to manage the framework. Probably most importantly, I feel, is that credit also is positioned at a level, and that indicates the challenge and the complexity and the depth of learning. So the content can persist through an academic program that has levels that progress, but it's how the learner engages with that material. And academic credit provides that structure across and through the levels, as well as we've talked about recognising prior learning, but also for a student in a standard academic program, it's still providing those progression points. And it also, in course design, helps you sort of focus on what you need to do to support the learner to progress through those levels of study. And I really hope this framework meets the needs of academics as well. We're quite a geeky, credity panel, to be honest. I don't think we're your ordinary academic. But what I hope, and when I look at the presentation of the framework, I feel that it is really quite accessible. And I hope in particular that we start to see academics using the guiding principles that are provided in the advice on the academic credit arrangements in part 1. The fact I've said part 1 makes me not sound like an academic, I know, but I really hope that those are used and we see those being referenced in course design, because I think they're really useful for academics when looking at credit in the context of either reviewing curriculum or developing new curriculum. I really hope that it meets the needs of academics in supporting approaches to course design. I really hope that they have conversations around this revised framework, and that, as we've talked persistently through this panel, and from the start, from the opening, that extends beyond the traditional discussion of undergraduate, and we use this framework. We're empowered to use this framework. Academics are empowered to use this framework to deliver, as we've described, much more flexible, accessible and agile approaches to recognising learning. So thank you.
Thank you, Claire. So I just wanted to ask a very quick question to the panel as a whole. I'll come to each of you in turn. And then we can get to, perhaps if we've got time, answer a couple of the questions that are taking place in the chat facility, which appear to be quite lively. But thankfully, the question that I'm going to ask is one of the themes that appears to be coming across in the chat, and that's about micro-credentials. Just coming to Johnny first, as micro-credentials are a developing feature of the HE landscape now, what sort of impact do you see the credit framework having in this space?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm really excited to see what comes from micro-credentials and the building blocks of them, and seeing them sort of progress. I think they're really good for people that have potentially been out of education for a while and are looking to come into higher education again, or for the first time that have been in industry for a while. And I'm really excited to see they use it for CPD and executive courses as credit-bearing CPD. I think that's quite exciting. Yeah, so how does this document help with micro-credentials? I think that the revised credit framework really focuses on the stackability of them. So how multiple 10 credit modules can eventually form, say, a graduate certificate if they were at level 6. And for me, at least from the student's perspective, in the wider picture, it's about making sure that these micro-credentials are seen by employers as qualifications in their own right, or are available to be stacked in a way that they turn into a recognized qualification. Because it's great for the learner to have, say, a 10 credit module in finance, the basic foundations of finance. But it's making sure that if they go for that promotion at work, or if they go to another job, that's also recognized by the employer. So I think that's sort of the next stage for the sector. And for next year, I know that the QAA are working on that sort of project. So yeah, I think their micro-credentials are really exciting. I'm seeing how flexible credit actually is for students coming in and exiting higher education at different points.
That's great. Thank you, Johnny. Can I come to Lucy next on the micro-credentials question?
Yeah, I think there are huge challenges around micro-credentials. I sat in on a panel at the recent QAA conference, and it was fascinating and thrilling and exciting to hear about all of these developments. But there are big challenges around microcredits in terms of a shared understanding or a kind of standardized sector approach to how these are monitored and delivered and quality assured. A lot of that will be embedded within a shared framework, which I hope is coming, and I think it would be hugely beneficial. But they are exciting because they do offer an enormous amount of flexibility and responsiveness to need, which institutions often struggle with on bigger programs, because we are so kind of stuck in an institutional system that isn't always as responsive as we'd like it to be, and it's definitely never as responsive as our students would like it to be. So I think the microcredits will offer us a massive sense of freedom with that. The other thing for me, which, coming from an art and design institution, that microcredits could do is address skills gaps. You don't necessarily need a huge established program to address a potentially quite small or niche gap in the student experience, but a microcredit would fill that perfectly. You can address massive national issues with microcredits that aren't tied to a standardized program format. And I think the flexibility to deliver those will be hugely beneficial, not just for the students taking them, but for the institution and the sector more broadly.
Thank you, Lucy. Can I throw the same question to Steve now?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try and come at it from a slightly different angle. I think absolutely agree with both things, the things that Lucy and Johnny have both said there. I think the flexibility will be great. I could imagine for employability, it's going to be fantastic, because somebody could take a micro-credential as a CPD. It could then be added to the CV in that section that says, what CPD have you done? And it could be something that could be done sort of over a 4-week, 6-week, 12-week period, whatever it is. The credit framework obviously hopefully would be supporting this, in the sense that an employer or anybody would like to see that currency is consistent. So being able to look at something and say, okay, I did a 6-week course in finance, and that 6-week course in finance is comparable to this 6-week course in finance over here. So there's still going to be that kind of being able to measure one against the other. I think will be important to do. I think if they're funded as well, which seems to be on the cards, that idea of the kind of the lifelong learning entitlement will be crucial, because I think for providers to be able to offer them in the evenings or at weekends or whenever they would be offered, there is a cost attached to that. And so, it's at the moment, a provider may think, well, do you know what? We've got these modules. They're great. We've written them. They work really well. Somebody could always join them during the day. But of course, that's not the case for somebody who's maybe in work who wants to do CPD that needs to be run at a different time. So I think the funding side of micro-credentials will be absolutely crucial to getting them off the ground.
That's great. Thank you. Very important issues there. Daryl next.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, just coming at it from a slightly different perspective. So focusing on the kind of creativity aspects that I think micro-credentials can bring, and also thinking about it from a group that's sometimes, not always front and center in these discussions, employers. So I know lots of universities up and down the country operate things called work-based learning frameworks, where they basically have a suite of small modules that are designed, the purpose of them is to be put together to form smaller qualifications or large qualifications as needs require. And often those programs, those combinations of modules are specifically designed to meet the needs of employers, sometimes large employers or groups of smaller employers, whatever. So, and in some cases, employers are running, training courses or CPD courses themselves, and those can be accredited so that they can actually lead to the award of higher education credit. And that credit can also be combined with smaller parts and components to do the same. So the combination of all these different kinds of elements, and micro-credentials are very much in this space, it seems to me, just hugely increases the kind of the flexibility, which has the effect of enabling a far higher degree of creativity in terms of what the possible solutions to different needs are, whether that's an employer need or some other initiative or a whole sector or whatever it is. So I think the funding thing is absolutely key, as Steve was identifying. I think some of the moves away from funding smaller components of higher education in a few years ago had a kind of negative effect on some of the flexibility that was afforded. So if that was brought in, I think that would make a big difference, I think, to how effective micro-credentials could be in the higher education landscape. But I think that, again, there are lots of examples about how these things can be combined in creative ways. And I think that having a higher education framework for England that provides the architecture, if you like, the stable architecture within which the creativity in terms of the way that these things can be combined is constituted. I think that's that's really, really important. You can't really have you can't be creative without having some kind of frame of reference within which to be created. So I'm hoping that the HE credit framework provides that frame for that creativity, and micro-credentials are a key component of that.
That's brilliant, thank you. And finally, Claire, do you have any reflections on micro-credentials?
Thank you. I mean, at my university, Liverpool John Moores University, we've always taken a very flexible approach, and I always say we don't do widening participation, we are widening participation, and there's real potential for micro-credentials to be used to complement, as Lucy described, to fill those sort of skills gap. We already have sort of qualifications that we would kind of put together to enable students to progress through either from a more foundation program or to change programs of study. So having this architecture now, and I think it also validates this approach. I think it gives a sort of credibility. It makes it a valid way for you to engage with your degree, not a sort of deficit support skill model, but a very positive model of how to progress through higher education. So I can see enormous opportunities in large, complex post-1992 universities like mine for continuing with that strong commitment to diversity and the broadening the participation of students in higher education.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to, well, thank you to the panel for your answers to that question as a whole. I just want to throw in my 2 cents worth at this point on micro-credentials. There's something that keen watchers of legislation, and there are a few of you out there, may have picked up recently, which is the first reading of the Professional Qualifications Bill. Now, this is a slightly techie piece of legislation that's designed to replace something that was taken away by Brexit, which is the European Establishment Directives, which allowed professionals from other EU countries to live and work and practice using their professional titles in this country, and eventually become registered professionals in their own right here. Now, that replacement has opened that beyond just EU countries and gives PSRBs in the UK massive scope to come up with arrangements for overseas lawyers, doctors, architects, any profession really, to practice over here. But what it does also do is give them the right to make determinations as to any gaps in their training, skills, experience, knowledge requirements. And that may be something that micro-credentials could potentially fill. I mean, obviously there may not be immediate neat fits between particular micro-credentials and the determinations that PSRBs make. But it is something that could possibly be an avenue for the sector to work together with PSRBs to develop, I mean, an off-the-shelf course that you could point an overseas social worker to in order to bring them up on a particular area of practice in this country would be an extremely valuable thing. But it's at very early development stage, and that's a little bit of crystal ball gazing right there. So if that doesn't come true, you didn't hear it from me. There's quite a few questions in the chat that I just wanted to look at for the next sort of 10 minutes or so. One of them is around the table itself, the table that appears as a centerpiece of the credit framework on page 8. And there's a question about how the minimum credits at the level of the qualification column in that framework, what that relates to. I mean, is there anyone on the panel who'd like to have a crack at that question before I do? Okay, well, I'll have a go in that case. The column really relates to the, and for those of you who don't have it on screen, it's a cellular column that relates to particular qualifications on particular levels of the framework, in particular the FHEQ. And it sort of tries to articulate what the minimum overall credits are for an award at that, for a particular award at that particular level. But also in parentheses, it lists what the minimum credits at that particular level are. So there's a total, which may be credits either below or even above the level of the award, but there's a core minimum of credits, say at level 6. So the typical bachelor's degree with honours will have 360 credits, which could be from a range, but at least 90 of those must be at FHEQ level 6 for it to be a correct award at that level. There's also a question. Oh, sorry, just lost it there for a second. There's also a question there about the old advice, or rather the counterpart to the first edition of the credit framework, which had a specific target audience of learners, of students. And we've been asked, being as it was a good plain English student-focused document, whether a similar document for the learner audience is intended to be developed. And I certainly support that myself, but I just wondered if any of the panel or my colleagues at the QAA would like to expand on that, on the potential of doing a student-focused or a student-facing document.
Yeah, I'll come in with that one, Si. So
thank you.
We hope that one of the aims of the advisory group in developing the credit framework was to put learners at the center of the revised guidance. And one of the aims was to create a document that we felt was intelligible and easily communicable to a non-specialist audience. And we hope we've achieved that with that process. In terms of further resources aimed at students, we are at the moment planning a set of activities around embedding the credit framework across different parts of higher education, looking at how it affects academics, how it might be used by quality teams, etc. And of course, one of the key focuses of that is how learners and students might understand the credit framework better. So we are planning a series of resources for the next QAA membership year, which will be aimed specifically at students, but it will be a member-only resource at the moment. But that's what we're planning for the next iteration of resources and support around these publications.
Thanks, Andy. There's also a couple of questions in the chat about whether we'll be writing a characteristic statement for micro-credentials. And the answer to that is yes, we will, and hopefully we'll be doing that in the next academic year. There's also some questions here, and I will have to refer to the panel's expertise on this, about whether there's going to be anything further on prescribed and non-prescribed level 4. Would anyone like to come in on that?
I'm not sure I can answer whether there's going to be anything further necessarily. I think that's probably beyond my pay grade. I don't know. But I think certainly prescribed and non-prescribed is something that we're very familiar with within the college HE sector, certainly. We run a lot of awards, AAT, for example, level 4, accountancy qualifications, various diplomas, etc. At the moment, these seem to sort of sit, between HE and non-HE. And I think within the document that we've put together, credit framework, we do have that kind of link, don't we, to the RQF kind of benchmark, so that those comparisons can be made. But certainly the advent of micro-credentials probably will also be a way of bringing some of those non-prescribed qualifications sort of more in line with some of the traditional HE, I guess.
I could maybe just add to what Steve said, if that's okay. Yeah, I mean, the direction of travel is really to, as it seems to me anyway, is to flex up the any kind of hard distinction between different kinds of qualifications and achievements that people can get, so that people can bring those things together and get appropriate recognition so that they can progress their careers, progress through higher education levels and the rest of it. So I think that seems to be at least clear in terms of the policy direction. How that will happen and the kind of, the policy detail that will underpin that, I think is yet to be, firmly determined. In the interim, and apologies for the plug, but there are things like the SEEK credit level descriptors that operate across, whether it's prescribed or non-prescribed, and can be used by people to kind of get an understanding of where different qualifications are sitting and think how things can sit together. And indeed, of course, the HE credit framework that we're talking about is really helpful in that regard also.
That's great, thank you. There's another little bonus question on micro-credentials, and I think this may have been touched on by the panel earlier, so I'll just come back to double check that. But in terms of things that are above one's pay grade, I think this certainly qualifies for mine. And the question is, will funding be available to students via the student loans company for micro-credential study? Again, if the person who touched upon this in the early discussion would like to go back to that, and my apologies, I can't remember exactly who it was.
Oh dear, I think it might have been me. I'm not sure. I think I mentioned funding. No, I'm just following it the way everybody else is following it, I think, at the moment. I think it was included in the Queen's speech, wasn't it? I think there was going to be funding for the lifelong learning entitlement, and I would assume that therefore that links up to the micro-credentials piece further down the line. I think as we said earlier on, though, I think funding would be crucial to this. And now whether it's through the SLC or not, I don't know.
Yeah, and as Sue's just added to the chat, it would be a horrifically complex field to administer. But yeah, like you say, we wait and see how that link to lifelong learning develops into a practical system for funding lifelong learning. So there was just one final question I'd like to come to before I hand back. And just before I do that, just my thanks personally to the panel for such an interesting discussion and handling all the questions that have been fired at them. But it's quite a biggie. What, if anything, is the added value of a traditional award such as an honours degree? If it's more than the sum of stackable parts, how do we go about categorising and communicating that? And that seems like a fairly fundamental philosophical question for the sector. Would anyone like to try and sink their teeth into that one?
I wouldn't mind actually going
for it, Johnny.
first, just for a few cents anyway. So being a student, so I finished my bachelor's degree in 2020, and I started a master's now in 2020. For 2020, I'll finish it in September. And being a student during COVID has really sort of opened my eyes to how important the community was. Sort of pre-pandemic, when we were learning together, I had luckily had a very stable course. So I had friends for 3 years at my bachelor's at Chichester. And I think from a student's perspective, the community, the learning community that you build together throughout your degree is really quite important. And let's not also forget the wider things that most universities and colleges offer, such as sports clubs, societies. And I think that whilst students from Microcredentials may engage in them, they also may not. We don't see many commuting students, at least from my experience. They're a focus area to try and get engagement within sports and societies and the wider university experience, and with part-time. So I think that that's really, from my perspective, the benefit of the full-time, say for 3 years bachelor's degree, is that the community that you will join as your degree, the original meaning of the degree, sort of the group of students graduating, and sort of the wider things that the universities offer.
Yeah, could I jump in there? So I think that's absolutely right from my point of view. Anyway, I think it's the nature of the learner experience, if you like, that is the kind of key determinant of the difference. I mean, from my own perspective, if I think about, typical, or some people might call them traditional, higher education students engaging in a 3-year honours degree experience on campus, and then I compare them with people doing a degree apprenticeship, which may be in the same area, the nature of their experience is likely to be very different, and not necessarily better or worse, but certainly different. I mean, for example, at my university, we have some people doing a 3-year apprenticeship to become police constables. They never come to the campus at all. All of the learning is either remote or it's delivered on site at the police force premises. So the nature of that experience, and of course, because they're in full-time employment, is necessarily very different to that being on a campus experience, having access to sporting facilities and social engagements and the rest of it. So I think there is a real kind of difference there in the nature of their experience. But I would say it's because obviously both of those examples are higher education. It's just that they are differently constructed to meet the needs of different people who want different kinds of experience at different times in their lives. And I think having those different options is a strength. And I think so that there's a continuity in terms of credit and how programs are constructed, and a lot to do with the architecture, and indeed lots of approaches to learning, whether it's online or not. And but there are kind of, as you said, Johnny, there's fundamental differences in the nature of the experience.
Thank you both. That's a very artful articulation of what makes the degree special that I think we can end the panel discussion on there. So once again, thank you to Johnny, Lucy, Steve, Daryl and Claire, and also Andy for jumping in at one point as well. And I'll hand you back over to Andy for the next part of the session.
Thanks, Si. So I've got about 6 minutes left to just take you through the kind of main features of both documents. My colleague Amy has put a link in the chat to the web page now, so you should be able to access both these documents on that web page. We also have some more information and resources that we have developed as part of this process, which we felt didn't quite fit in either document, but we feel would be very helpful and very interesting for people, that we will actually add to the web pages over the coming weeks and months. So please keep a lookout on that web page for more information as it comes up, and more resources. I think the first thing to say really is that the advice is contained in 2 documents. The first document is called the Higher Education Credit Framework for England, Advice on Academic Credit Arrangements. And the second document is called Making Use of Credit, a companion to the Higher Education Credit Framework for England. As we've developed this work with the advisory group were very clear quite early on that they wanted to develop a route map, if you like, for providers and learners on how credit can be applied in lots of different contexts. And originally this was one fairly large document, but as the work was developed, we realized that actually it would make sense to divide it into two separate resources. So the first resource, which is the Higher Education Credit Framework Advice on Academic Credit Arrangements, really builds upon the long-standing practice in UK higher education around the use of credit. It's the part of the document that contains the credit framework table and also guiding principles, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a second. The other document, which is the Making Use of Credit, as I said, tries to give an overview of how credit can be used within a range of emerging aspects of higher education, like microcredentials, but it also talks about RPL, CPD, and those issues as well. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second. Next slide, please, Amy. So this is the content list for the first document for the Credit Framework for England Advice and Academic Credit Arrangements. As you can see, it sets out the context through which credit is used in higher education, both in the UK and in Europe. It offers advice on how learners and providers can use credit. And I think, again, just reflecting back on some of the points that were made by Sue and by the advisory group, that the advisory group really did start from the position that for them, learners should be at the centerpiece of this work, of this advice. They wanted to be a fairly impactful document that demystified the more arcane aspects of credit that could be around in higher education and could be easily understood by students, learners, and other stakeholders in HE. So as has already been mentioned, it's designed really to be empowering for both learners and providers. It is important to say, though, that it sits outside of the regulatory framework in England. So it's not part of the Office for Students regulatory framework, and it won't be a sector recognised standard as defined by the Office for Students. But that does give us some freedom in how we actually use it in the context of it being a tool for enhancement and empowerment. Next slide, please, Amy. So this page just sets out how providers can use this advice in a range of different contexts. So we talk about the design of new courses, study exchanges, and as well as allowing for flexibility in what Lucy was talking about earlier about starting and resuming study for learners at different points of the learning journey. Next slide, please, Amy. This particular slide has the credit framework table for England. It aligns qualifications to the appropriate level on the FHEQ. And as Sai has already mentioned, and we've had some queries in the chat, it also talks about the minimum value of credit that is aligned to each award. We've also included the ECTS credit value on the far right, and also what is also known as the Dublin descriptor cycle, so the qualification framework for the European Higher Education Authority cycles as well. It's important to note that this table is taken from existing sector reference points, including the FHEQ and Annex C and the qualifications descriptors. So it is based upon what is already fairly existing practice in the sector. We do make the point that this table does not contain all qualifications awarded by higher education providers, so we are aware of that and we make that clear. It's not designed to be a register of qualifications in that sense. And obviously, given that degree awarding bodies maintain responsibility for the award of their qualifications as well. Next slide, please, Amy. We felt it would also be useful to set out some guiding principles for the use of credit within this document. Very similar to those of you that are familiar with the advice and guidance themes that support the Quality Code for Higher Education. We think they can be used as a point of reference for providers to consider when looking at credit in the context of developing new or revising existing higher education provision. Next slide, please, Amy. We also touch a little bit in this document on workload, notional learning hours and assessment, very much what Claire was also talking about in terms of how they can be used in the design of courses. Just to say that for our QAA members, we'll be developing some much more detailed work on these areas in the upcoming membership year, specifically looking at assessment in the context of credit, assessment in the context of notional learning hours, what that means for students, how you design appropriately weighted modules with credit and with assessment weighting as well. So please keep a lookout if you're a QAA member for that activity that will be coming up in the next membership year. And then finally, just a couple of slides before we finish on the last document, which is making use of credit. And again, as already mentioned, what we try to do with this document is to outline the various ways in which credit can be used in the context of supporting flexible learning, for example, with microcredentials or apprenticeships. The advisory group was very keen that we complement the contextual detail around credit that is contained in the first document with this more practical and supportive set of advice for learners and for providers to look at the different ways of approaching credit. And we think that this can be used as a really good reference guide to support providers in developing new types of courses and qualifications. Next slide, please, Amy. So what we have here are the contents for this particular section. And as you can see, it outlines various different types of approaches to how credit can be used, including, as I said, microcredentials, apprenticeship, short courses, CPD, RPL, and it finishes with the with how you can apply it to the postgraduate student experience as well. Next slide, please, Amy. What we've done also is we've included reflective questions after each subheading, which hopefully will prove helpful to you to go back to your own providers and consider how you would apply credit in the context of all those particular sections. Next slide, please. I think that's mainly it from us for today. Thank you for attending. I just first of all like to offer a really big thanks on behalf of QAA to the members of the advisory group that you can see on your screen. Some of them obviously are with us here today, both on the panel and not on the panel. So thank you all for being able to make this launch. As Sue said earlier, when we started this work in January 2020, we had no idea that we would be completing it in the midst of a once-in-a-century pandemic. And as Sue writes in her foreword to the first document, that this advisory group has managed to both focus and innovate to complete design and writing tasks on time and with good humor. And it's a testament to their expertise and professionalism. So thank you all for that. Thank you also to our critical readers who gave us some really great feedback during the development of these documents, and also to Mary Bishop, who also provided some excellent content to the documents. And also thank you to all of you who contributed to the feedback that we had from the consultation. I think those of you who had read the pre-Christmas consultation document and then were to read these two documents will be able to see quite significant changes and developments based on feedback that we had from you. So we do see this work as being very much co-created and co-owned by the sector, thanks to your input and support. I'd also just quickly like to thank the design team at the QAA for doing such a great job on the design and the general look of the documents. So thank you all for attending. I think hopefully you will find the advice in both these documents useful, supportive of your current practice, with the aim of ensuring that learners or students are able to graduate with great outcomes and go on to make a difference to building a fairer and more equitable future. So thank you for your time today, and stay safe.